This is Radio TV Phononut, and what we have here is a Packard Bell wireless record player, 78 RPM only, probably from the early 1940s. And what I mean by wireless record player is that it contains a small, low-powered AM transmitter that's designed to broadcast the music from the record grooves to a nearby AM radio, thus allowing radios that don't have either a built-in phonograph or a phono input jack for a wired phono attachment to be used for a record player. Cabinet's kind of skint up on this, and we're missing the knob, but I'm sure just about any generic knob would work, so I'm really not too worried about that. One of our corner pieces has come unglued. We'll have to glue that back in place, but we'll get it working first. Nice enough to give us a schematic. We have a 35Z5 rectifier and a 50L6 oscillator, and that's being modulated by a 35L6. It always amazes me the weird tube lineup that these little wireless record players often have, but they did it in such a way that when the tube filaments are all added up, it equals the line voltage. You'll notice our cloth-covered power cord here. This looks like some asbestos cord, like what you'd see on a heating appliance, so that may or may not be original. Here's the chassis. It looks nice and roomy. Here's our antenna wire that looks like it's attached to this bottom here some way or another, probably running around this plate here. Okay, we'll first start by getting rid of these condensers that are almost certainly bad by now. And yeah, I'd say by the construction, this is probably late 30s, early 40s, based on the cloth-covered wire and the style of the components used. Alright, while we're in the middle of replacing the capacitors, I'll bring up a point here. This is a dual-section electrolytic capacitor that someone used to replace these two capacitors, except they didn't bother to remove the old capacitors from the circuit. They just bridged the new one across. Now, that practice was actually condoned in some radio and TV service books from back in the day, but it's not a good idea because these old capacitors can short, and if that happens, it doesn't matter if you have a new capacitor bridged across them or not. Then you've just placed a short circuit in the works, and that can cause major trouble. Okay, I have all of the capacitors replaced. I replaced one resistor that was severely out of tolerance. I replaced the power cord, and I replaced the asbestos cabling going up to the motor switch. After I looked at this, I think it came with an asbestos power cord. You're probably wondering why they did that. Well, back when World War II was first getting cranked up, supplies and materials were often not easy to come by, so a lot of these manufacturers had to use whatever they could get their hands on. And of course, sometime in the early to mid part of 1942, I believe, is when all consumer electronics stopped and all the factories concentrated their efforts to making things for the war effort. Alright, let's put our scope probe on our RF output, and as you can see, we're getting some RF here, so we're at least generating a carrier frequency. And we have the radio tuned to said frequency, and when I touch the audio input to the transmitter, you can hear a buzz in the radio. And when I kill the power to the transmitter, you can hear the carrier fade into oblivion. So I think we can put all this back in the cabinet now and concentrate on the pickup cartridge and the drive mechanism. Okay, the chassis is back in, and I like to check things as I go. And yes, we still have RF. So now let's pull the tone arm out and address the cartridge. It'd be easier for me just to pull it out and work on it than to try to do what needs to be done to it while it's mounted in the cabinet. Here's the tone arm. This is a Shure high-low tone arm and cartridge, and thank goodness it's made out of Bakelite because the metal ones are really heavy. There's no counterbalance spring here, unless you want to call this thing a counterbalance spring, but that ain't much help. So hopefully, since this is made of Bakelite, and when I remove this heavy cartridge, maybe it'll make it light enough to where a more modern cartridge will track in this thing. Here's the old cartridge. Looks like it's date stamped April 1942, so that falls in line with my expectations of when this was made. And that's also not long before consumer electronics production stopped. And this is light enough without the cartridge that I think we can get away with tracking a modern cartridge in here without too much difficulty, especially since we're dealing with 78s. Here we are with our 89T cartridge holder installed. This is one that I recently removed from a 4-speed classroom record player that I converted to use a standard fan steel P226 cartridge. And the reason I do that is because the traditional style flip cartridges with LP on one side and 78 on the other are getting scarce. However, they still make the green 78 RPM only cartridge, and that's what I'll eventually be installing in here. But for testing purpose, I'll just rob one of these types of cartridges out of one of my classroom record players. This one here is a total dud. But yeah, in today's world, your options for 89Ts are either the red single-sided LP only or green single-sided 78 only, or new old stock LP and 78 when you can even find them, and they're like 25 bucks a piece. However, since this is 78 only, we don't need a multi-speed cartridge for that. We'll just order the green one from the VM website when the time comes, and that should get us back in business. Okay, I haven't cleaned the motor yet, but let's see what happens. A little bit on the sluggish side. And a classic sign of needing lubrication. Oh yeah.
If you love me half as much as I love you, you wouldn't worry me.
And unlike the Sears, this one doesn't need a preamp stage. This 89T is kicking it real good. Of course, this is a two-tube set, where the Sears one that we recently did was only a single tube. And on this particular model, if you need to change the transmit frequency, you do so by adjusting this trimmer right here, and that's accomplished by lifting off the turntable platter, and then you can adjust it to the desired frequency. Except for the idler wheel needing attention, everything else is done. Now the range on this is not too great. Of course, it would probably be better if I added an external wire antenna. But this was basically meant to sit next to the radio. It wasn't really meant to broadcast a great distance. And we have the modulation control turned all the way down, so that's good. Okay, well that ought to about do it for this video. Another one saved and ought to be good to go for another 50 years or 70 years or however old this thing is. Yeah, more like about 1942 and fixing to be 2017. It's about 75 years.